Hi, welcome to Philippians in 10, a short series of 10-minute talks about Paul's letter to the Philippians. So far we've been talking about how in this letter Paul is remapping the Philippians universe. He's helping them see a more fundamental reality than that of the Roman colony in which they live. Paul's universe is ruled by King Jesus, to whom every knee, including the emperors, will bow, where humility, service, joy and unity are the dominant values, and not the violence and grasping that characterises Rome. Now we want to look at how, as part of remapping the universe, Paul remaps the Philippians' idea of God. So here we're looking at Philippians chapter 2, 6 to 11. Put the video on pause and get a Bible or open your phone app and read these verses. Then come back and hit play. We saw last week how Paul's talk about citizenship and awaiting a saviour in 3:20 and 21 would have resonated with the Philippians, who were very conscious of living in a city that had strong links to Rome. And the significance of Paul's depiction in chapter 2 of Jesus as having the ultimate authority in the universe would not have been lost in the Philippians. The exalted Jesus has infinitely more authority than that of the Roman emperor, and he's more authority than any of the multiplicity of gods that people worshipped in Philippi. The world has changed irrevocably. A crucified and resurrected Jew is now at the centre of the universe. He is the one who calls the shots, not the might of Rome, nor any of the gods in the pantheon or the mystery cults that abounded in this world. The emperor was the one who claimed to bring peace and order to the peoples of the empire. The gods were worshipped in the hope that they would show you some favour and bring good fortune and blessing to your neighbourhood. But all these claims are laid bare for the sham that they are by the lordship of Jesus over all. And crucially, Jesus' lordship is based on something entirely different than the emperors or any of the gods. In these verses 6 to 11 of chapter 2, Paul is doing two things. First, by pointing to Christ's ultimate authority, he's encouraging the Philippians. They're suffering at the hands of their neighbours and the authorities. He wants them to stand firm in the knowledge that Christ is the one who has the real authority and is in control of their lives. Second, Paul is showing that real authority and power come from humility and service, not self-promotion and grasping. In order to do this, he points to the example of Christ, and we get these theologically rich and really quite amazing 6 verses, often known as the Christ hymn. The first 3 verses take us from Christ's pre-existence as part of the Godhead, then into his incredible humility through incarnation and execution on the cross. And the final 3 highlight how God vindicated Jesus' humility and service by raising him to the highest place in the universe. Paul doesn't mention the resurrection and ascension here, but they're assumed. Paul starts by describing Christ as equal with God, in the form of God, meaning he had the nature of God. Clearly, Paul thinks of Christ as existing prior to his time on earth. But Christ didn't think that that was something to be grasped or exploited. This is in complete contrast to the sort of rulers that the Philippians normally experienced. And more generally, this was a world where status and privilege were things strived after and grasped at. Perhaps not so different from our own world. In 2:3, Paul had warned the Philippians about empty glory. Now he says, clearly referencing back, that Christ emptied himself of his pre-existent glory and became human, becoming like a slave. Excuse me. Slavery was part of life for the Philippines. Slaves were the lowest of the low. People did not become rulers and emperors by submitting themselves to slavery. But Christ became a person without advantages, with no rights or privileges. The Lord of glory, the one equal with God, becomes a servant of all. The first phrase in verse 6 is usually translated as, although he was in the form of God. But New Testament scholar Michael Gorman suggests there's a good argument for translating this as because he was in the form of God, which means that Christ emptied and humbled himself precisely because he was in the form of God. In other words, it is in God's very nature to give himself in such a way. Christ's self-humbling in his incarnation and death reveals the very essence of God, utter self-giving love. In any case, the entire passage, when we understand what Paul is saying about Christ's identity as part of the Godhead, it's quite clear about the incredible self-giving of God. There's an emptying, a self-humbling, a self-giving that just beggars belief. Not simply that the Messiah would be found in human form, but that he would be prepared to be executed on a cross. The cross is the end point of the self-emptying of God, not simply the taking on of humanity, but being executed as a criminal in the most shameful, brutal way possible. So here we have the stark expression of who God is. The cross shows God's nature to be utter love, naked, selfless, self-giving love. So these verses tell us not only about Jesus, but about the very nature of God. Paul then moves on from these three verses that paint such a startling picture of the nature of God to the result of Christ's humility and submission to death on the cross. Unlimited obedience and humiliation give way to unlimited vindication and exaltation. God highly exalted him, says Paul, using a verb that occurs only here in the New Testament and means that God super exalted him. A similar word is used of Israel's God in Isaiah 52 and Psalm 97. And here we begin to see the remarkable way in which Paul starts to identify Jesus with Yahweh, the Most High, the highly exalted, the God of all. God has granted Jesus the supreme name, Kurios, Lord, the very name in the Greek Old Testament that was used to represent the name of God. Paul has in view, as he goes on in verse 10, Isaiah 45:23. This verse is the climax of a passage in Isaiah that is the fullest statement of Israel's belief that her God, Yahweh, is the creator of the world and the only God of all the earth. Paul is making the stunning claim that Jesus, clearly seen as part of the divine identity, is the one whom everyone will acknowledge as sovereign. And that goes for every authority and power, not just on earth, but in the heavens and under the earth. This far surpasses the authority claimed by Caesar or any of the gods. Christ is Lord of all. So in these verses, Paul has remapped the Philippians' idea of God. The very nature of God is loving, humble service. And Jesus, the pre-existent one, is part of the Godhead, and he's been exalted to the highest place in the universe. Despite all the trials and difficulties the Philippians are facing, and despite all the difficulties that we face, they are to know that the ultimate authority over our lives is Jesus, is a God who loves us and has come to be with us. And the Philippians knew that this God is unlike any other God in the pantheon or any other earthly ruler. In this superstitious world, people did not expect Jupiter or Diana or any of the gods to love them. The gods were capricious. You feared what they could do to you. But here is a God, actually the God of all gods, whose very nature is love, who loved the Philippians completely and wholly, and in the person of Jesus came to serve and to express that love in the most tangible way. The God that Paul presents here is in his very nature a God of love. And God in Jesus models a way of being human that Paul holds up to the Philippians as the model of how they are to behave and live. So Paul turns all the expectations about what God is like, what human life is like, on its head. The Philippians were used to a world where might was right, where the poor and vulnerable were taken advantage of, where hierarchy, status, the seeking of power was the norm, if needs be with violence. Now they see that the universe works on fundamentally different principles. And that's something we need to understand too. Although our world is very different from the first century in Greece, we see the same forces at work. Politics, celebrity culture, extreme capitalism all say that the way up is through force, through pushing, through striving for position and notice. But Jesus shows us that the way up is down, through humble, self-giving service. And just as the Philippians needed to know that the God of the universe loved them utterly and completely, so too do we. In our own world of individualism, consumerism, the need to achieve, this often robs us of our sense of value and of being loved. But what we see in Philippians 2, 6-9 is the incredible love of God for us, and which Paul says is the model for us to follow, to go into the world showing the same humility, self-sacrifice and love that Christ has shown. Tall order? Of course it is, but as Paul says in 2:14, God is at work within us. So once more we see how Paul has remapped the Philippians and our universe, showing us that there is a more fundamental reality than what we simply see around us. And that is based on the incredible love of God and the absolute lordship of Jesus.